Welcome. We are here with Professor Nick Zangwill, who's been touring Portugal for the past week. You were in Lisbon delivering a lecture, the first of 3 lectures. One on the ethics of meat eating, the second one in Guimarães on the aesthetics of architecture, formalism and politics, and finally in Porto, the evolution of miscommunication, game theoretical approaches to language. This interview will focus on your work on music, the aesthetics of music. I would start by asking you, what was your personal path to music and music together with philosophy? How did it all come about?
Yeah, not quite in that way. My doctorate had very little to do with aesthetics, and almost nothing to do with music. So I came to it quite after my career was up and going in other directions, and I sort of went sideways. I did a segue and started doing more aesthetics. I did very little aesthetics. My doctorate had, I think, half a chapter or 1 chapter out of 12 on aesthetics. And I came to it later when I started teaching. My first jobs were in America. It was tough getting a job in the UK, so I got an interesting job doing lots of teaching in the States. First one was East Carolina, and I suppose I confronted people there doing aesthetics in a way that seemed odd or alien in some ways, and I suppose I found something to kick against. So I started doing that as well as everything else I was doing, and I still kept on with everything else. It's just that the books tended to be in aesthetics. So I wrote series of papers, intending them to be part of a book. So they weren't it wasn't random how they came about. So I would try out some ideas in papers and then put them together. Actually, the first 2 books were originally conceived of as one, with the first part on beauty and the second part on art, but then it seemed sensible to separate them. Really, my doctorate was on metaethics, and really I would say that's sort of my main centre, or love in a way, not main, but love. It's the sort of main central thing I do, which is really about value. So I suppose there's value, and then there's what to say about it in ethics, and then there's when you come to aesthetics, I also think it's very important to talk about value, and that's when I mentioned something to kick against, because I found both in the US and to some extent in the UK, but less so, people wanted to downgrade value in thinking about aesthetics, of all places. So if you remember Volheim's book, Art and Its Object, the very last sentence is, "I've said nothing in this book about value, and that's deliberate." And it is like he was proud of it. And I said to him, I found this odd. I met him once, I was in Berkeley, and I said, that book you wrote on, it's got a very odd last sentence. How can you, even if you think it's a separate topic, so he then had a separate essay on it, on value, in the second edition. Mm-hmm. But no, I think that was misguided, because you cannot separate value in thinking about all the other issues in art in the way he wanted to in that book. And the Americans are even worse. The United States, I should say, people are even worse the way they take value out. Dickey did it in a fundamental way in his theory of art. We're not talking about the valuative notion, he said. That seemed to me a mistake. And so the people I like, I'm very old school, and I'm proud to be old school in some ways. So in British terms, I always liked Sibley, did I even meet him? But anyway, but he was a great figure for me, especially the second paper, Aesthetic, Non-Aesthetic. But there's also, of course, aesthetics concepts is important, but also the second one is very important. And I think he told me by letter that was originally conceived as part of the first article, so that was ready much earlier. It's a beautiful piece, actually, aesthetic, non-aesthetic. I recently wrote a paper in 2018 called Epistemic, Non-Epistemic Dependence, which was a nod to Sibley. So Sibley, he talks about aesthetic concepts and aesthetic features generally, but there's a place for value there. And over in the United States, Beardsley, he was unashamed to make value not just a central topic. You see, that's the thing. It's not just a topic that we should take seriously. It's something that you should weave into the way you do the rest of aesthetics. And I didn't like this sort of drawing out. It's like sort of aesthetics decaffeinated or low alcohol aesthetics. You take the value out of it, and I just don't think what you have left is that worthwhile or revealing, because it is the domain of value. And even when you're thinking about the metaphysical issues or these other issues that you get in aesthetics, if you take the value out of it, you'll lose your way. And actually, I agree with Scruton makes the same point. He's sort of a bit sniffy about the ontology of art, because it's supposed to be this neutral enterprise. I mean, I love metaphysics, and metaphysics is a great topic, and we should all do it. And there's no not doing it. It's like there's people who, there's a kind of Wittgensteinian who pretends that they're not doing it, metaphysics, but that's what's the technical term? Bullshit, if I may say. If I say, and you can find them. It's like sort of Puritans who say, "Oh, I'm not interested in affairs of the flesh," and then you find them doing something weird and perverted.
Yeah,
and similarly with metaphysics, you pretend that you're not doing it. So we should do it, but when you do the metaphysics or in aesthetic areas, it's got to take a specific form. One in which value is central. God, I've talked a lot there.
Yeah. Yes, you like to describe yourself as carrying the banner for Beardsley.
In some ways.
And you regret not having met him.
Yeah, I told Jerry Levinson that I said, I think I say in my book, the greatest book, because Sibley never really wrote a book in aesthetics in the sort of after the wartime, is Beardsley's book, Aesthetics, Problems and Criticism, I think it's called. And he said I was being provocatively retrograde, which is fine. So, yeah, Beardsley, and the book is a wealth of good stuff. I mean, if there's some topic you're interested in, and you just look up what Beardsley has to say about it, way back in '58, it's great. It's very rich and very insightful.
So it's a bit like having a punk approach, this conservative approach, because see, like the way punk reacted to all that progressive.
Sort of, yeah. I mean,
you think it's a good analogy?
You've got me there. I mean, I was of that era, so I was also listening to all kinds of music, but really, I had my friends, they were listening to progressive rock, Genesis, Yes, the later Pink Floyd, all this sort of slightly intellectual stuff, and punk came along, and it was very refreshing, and I was pogoing along with the others. So in some sense, yeah, it's trashing stuff that needed to be trashed in some ways. I don't know, you're not supposed to put things in the way, you're supposed to be more gentle in how you put things, that they were missing out on things, but I think in the way people approach things, they had to get something wrong, so I tried to
I know your musical preferences extend far beyond the so-called Western classical music, including punk, we just mentioned, Greek Rebetika.
Yeah, I love Rebetika.
Could you tell us a bit more about your relationship with different musical genres? What ticks your...
yeah, it's difficult to. I think that. Now you slightly got me that it could be that if I start talking about why I like certain things, I might say some things inconsistent with some of the views I've defended. I mean, I saw a concert the other night here. Was that 2 nights ago?
2 nights ago.
The overture to Tristan,
Strauss.
a Strauss
And Mahler.
poem, and some Mahler, and there's something my tastes are more classical in some ways. So I like a lot of 20th century music, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Shostakovich. But some of that late romantic stuff is maybe it goes along with neo-Kantianism, which I don't really do either. The same sort of era of sort of high German pretentiousness, or taking too seriously, and of course I love Bach to death, and some of the other classical, well-known composers. I'm writing a paper on Bach at the moment, which I have been for a time, which is very long. It's got too long. But I suppose a lot of the music I've always liked has been quite intense and rather very sort of serious music. So, if I want a cantata, I don't want a sort of peasant's cantata or coffee cantata. I want a real sort of blood and guts, crucifixion, death, and full of gore type cantata.
I see.
And of course, I remember when I was 20, I think, when I first heard the Bach solo sonatas for violin, partitas for violin. I mean, that was a major moment in my musical evolution. So I listened to those almost every day for years. And I've always been in search of the perfect violinist, actually. Which I've. My parents they meant well, but they gave me I said I wanted this for my 21st birthday, and they gave me the Yehudi Menuhin version, which is,
Mm-hmm.
There are better ones. But there's a kind of, I don't know what unites this, but the intensity of Rebettica, and of course I like the sort of mixture of order and chaos in Rebettica, where you have, these, you have the kind of sort of what looks like European order, and then you have this 9/8 or strange time signatures. But I think with Turkish and Iranian music, you don't have the kind of the framework of the bouzouki.
Yeah.
So I like that sort of combination of where Europe sort of hits the Middle East, and the combination of the two, I think, is also flamenco, of course, is the same thing, the same phenomena, which I very much like flamenco as well. So I don't really like happy music, and who wants to be happy music? And then this sort of painful romantic emotions that you're supposed to have in the late 19th century. Give me a break, you
must like Beethoven, because
of course,
you brought grumpiness into music.
Yeah, no, grumpiness is good. I mean, there's these, of course, there's Beethoven. Then there's the sort of happy little sheep flitting in the fields, like gambling away between the sort of intense bits. I think like Taruskin, I love the ninth, of course, but I'm not sure about that. The last movement, it was formally a stroke of genius. Because you can't have 4 movements of pure Beethoven tearing his hair out, and 3 was enough. And of course it works in some sense musically, but what it's asking me to feel, it's like at the concert the other night of the Mahler, the Strauss, and the Wagner. No, I don't want you. Don't tell me to feel that. I don't want to. Yeah. So this has come back to Hanslick. If I can probably cutting in something, which is you're probably going to ask later, but you know, I mean, one of the points about Hanslick, which I've realised since I wrote that piece, which you translated, is that he's not really making this pure philosophical claim that music cannot, you know, arouse or express emotion. Cannot, though that's kind of claim from metaphysics. He, and this is stuff I'm working on now, things I'm writing now, but he thinks it can. He thinks it can, but it shouldn't. It's a bad thing. So he thinks that, I mean, it's sort of you're reacting to the wrong sort of component of the music. You're just reacting to its material constitution and not what's properly musical in it as an art, which is its musical beauty constructed by relations between tones. So that the kind of emotions. So when I'm there at the concert hall a couple of nights ago, you know, they're dragging me to feel something, and I'm like, yeah, I know you want me to feel something. I know the music's maybe designed to produce this feeling, but no, thank you. Just say no to that.
Kind of dovetails with the idea of musical works as artifacts, and artifacts can have proper functions and imposed functions. So the essential function of music, you could describe it that way. It's not to. It can express, represent, etc., but it's not what makes it music.
Yeah, I think I once would have put it that way, but I've been talking to too many musicologists from whom I've learned something, more than something, but the essential function of music. So if you say that to a musicologist, they'll say, well, which music, when, they have a suspicion of those kind of very general claims that philosophers like. And I'm not embarrassed to make general claims. Obviously, a lot of philosophy is about, highly general claims. When it comes to the essential function of the essential function of one of those pieces the other night, if you talk about the essential function of a particular piece of music rather than music abstractly, was to get me to feel certain things. So I'm sorry, no, I'm not gonna, this is a hammer, but that's what it is. I'm not gonna use it to bang in a nail. I know you're trying to get me to feel this kind of late 19th century nonsense, but I'm just not gonna feel that. And I don't want to feel that, and I don't think I should feel that. Give me something, my music, I want something a bit more intellectual or abstract. So, a general claim about I think, you see, this is back to Hanslick. I think to some extent it's a normative claim. It's really what it should be, not what it maybe is, because, he was, as people point out, he was sort of both philosophical and engaged as a critic. He was doing both. And I think you have to do both in a way. This is the sort of truth, strangely, in Quineanism. Quine's approach to philosophy, that there's the abstract, very abstract sort of metaphysical, ontological claims you make, but they're not separate from inquiry in an area more generally, and your substantive commitments in thinking in the area in question. So I think there's something right about that Quinean denial that you can just have a quite abstract sort of discourse in philosophy, conceptual analysis or whatever it's supposed to be, and then this completely different issue, then there's your views and how you engage in thinking in that area. You can't, I think he's right that you can't make that separation. And in the philosophy of music, there's, and I don't know if I was maybe right about this in the early paper, I'd write it differently now, but you can't separate views of what it is from views of how it should be, from views your actual taste in the concert hall. You're also, one is a philosopher, but one's also enjoys making and experiencing music. I don't think you can pull those apart.
So, going back to the Beethoven, Actually, my favorite symphony is the fifth. And
It's
there is that moment.
It's got some moments.
That moment just before when you're coming to the fourth movement,
Yeah.
and you're finally getting to it, and I feel this. I want to kick the furniture, but
Yeah.
out of joy. Some, affirmative, pure. And you say in your latest book that there's something somewhat heavy metalish about the allegedly sublime passages of the Beethoven symphonies.
Yeah.
But I was curious about this contrast between the allegedly sublime and the heavy metalish. And
Yeah.
This.
I don't know what the sublime worries me, and it's worried me, especially in the case of music. The sublime in the case of art, especially John Martin, which I'd recommend to anyone in the Tate Britain with his Last Judgment and other works. But that sort of makes some sense to me, where you've got sort of rocks crashing down on people who are being crushed in huge numbers. But the sublime in music is talked about, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it. So that's why I'm slightly skeptical about it. I mean, there's something. There's something. I draw a comparison there between there's a sort of head banging. I think Taruskin goes on about this as well. I mean, I'm a huge Taruskin fan. It's very sad he died recently, but he says it's really a percussion symphony at a certain point. It's all sort of drumming, and there's this
head banging.
There's something raw and heavy metal about it, which in a great way. And there's sort of an anger in it, so I'm using an emotional description there, and there is this bit where you seem to have this kind of frustration and then sort of bursting out, which Susan McClary talks about. But she's sort of onto something about it. You don't have to describe it in her way, though. All that's rather wonderful. And that's the paradox in a way. It's sort of anguished, and if you're going to describe it in emotional terms, you'll use these, terms like that. But that couldn't make you feel happier to listen to it. So
we can take them as metaphors.
That would be a way to go.
But and for sure, a lot of music you can make up all sorts of stories that go along with it.
Yeah.
But in this cases like these, it seems that it's somehow welded to your enjoyment in a way that is it. I wonder. It makes me wonder. Is it consistent to maintain the formalist attitude? Is it enough to say it's just a metaphorical description that I could exchange for some other equally appropriate metaphorical description, or is there something especially appropriate with that?
Especially appropriate. I think different people. I mean, Hanslick makes this point that people have quite different descriptions of the same pieces over times, and to some extent, when you describe something, you go to describe something difficult to describe, and you're drawing on metaphors and other non-standard uses of language to try and get at it. For example, if you're describing how you're feeling, that's also difficult to get at. And I think you'll draw on a lot of things which are quite personal to you or your culture, which might not mean very much to someone else or from someone in a different culture, because it's kind of local, the way of describing it. I suppose we might find, I suppose it might be the case that we can't think of any better terms than those emotional descriptions to fix on what we like so much about it or what's so valuable to us. I think we can also, if you struggle, you think, well, okay, describe that piece of music, right, but you're not allowed to use those metaphors, you've got to use these metaphors. You can do it, you can describe it in terms of, you describe, okay, we were at the beach yesterday, look, and the surf was coming in, and these wonderful rocks right there, poof, you know, it hits, and the waves were just going everywhere, and enormous power the way they hit the rocks.
Like shards of glass everywhere.
Yeah, there's all sorts of ways you could describe it, but you could also use that as a way to describe some of what Beethoven is doing in some of those passages, the sort of heavy metal passages. I think you could also, you know, you just have to get a bit creative, and the metaphors we use are, to some extent, they're, as feminists have rightly pointed out, they're ideological to some extent. They use certain metaphors, not others. And you can be creative and think of alternative metaphors to describe things which can work equally well or better. But if you come from a certain sort of experience or cultural background, it could be that certain metaphors will work for you. So you might, if you're speaking to someone who's got a different experience from you, but you know something about their background experience, you might use metaphors that would particularly they would get. But so I think there's something pragmatic about the choices of ways of describing what we think is interesting or great about some music.
One of my favorite quotations from you is a sort of description of formalism, which is the following: listening to music is an isolated and lonely encounter with another world, a disembodied world of beautiful sound, far from the world of human life. To humanize music is to desecrate it. Music is inhuman and awesome because of it, like stars in the night sky.
Yeah, that was naughty.
It's almost like
I mean, I was writing it to. I mean, okay, I was writing it. I sort of. You see, this goes back to punk rock. You know, punk rock. You know, I mean, one of the great things we all know is that the Sex Pistols were on TV. And famously, all these people were watching TV, and they were so angry that they they threw things at the TV and smashed their own TVs. So I suppose I imagine musicologists doing that when they read that.
When they read this, I think personally, I remember that only a rational animal can be irrational. So I was. You need human to be. This inhuman needs human, because you see, the stars in the night sky, the awesome, this is speaks of us.
Yeah, I mean, of course, what I'm getting at is the kind of abstractness of what we're appreciating in music, in a way that Scruton also talks about, and he gets it to some extent from Zuckerkandl as well, who's a great writer, Austrian writer. Viennese writer, and this idea that when you're sort of in the music, in the world of it, when you're listening to it, and when you follow it, you are, you're moving, you're following that phrase, and your mind is moving in that sort of world. The sort of apparent world of music. Scruton talks about this a lot, so there's something phenomenologically right about it. And it couldn't be more opposed to a lot of the nonsense people will talk about, in fact this is a code for talking about this social structure and all that, which is just, it seems to me that there are such things, if you hear the Marseillaise or something, you think, oh, I know what that's signalling. That's music as sort of code, but that's so trivial, and such a trivial part of music. And of course it is that they're called topics. And they exist, and it's trivial. And they're not part of what's interesting or valuable about hardly any music, that it's a bunch of codes, so that you have to read it, as Susan McClary says. So partly that's what I'm kicking against there. But also it speaks to, back to my own experience of the Bach partitas and sonatas. When you've got a really good violinist and not one who's sloppily, romantically emotional all over the place. I like someone called Reinhard Barchet, but he didn't. Yeah, he only recorded the ones with the harpsichord and violin. Not anyway. So if you get a really good one who's not sloppily romantic, which then because that sort of pulls you back to earth, if you like. But if you're just sort of there, transfixed by this almost mathematical structure, as people have, across many different cultures have found this analogy with mathematics. But it is something we are appreciating intellectually with what Hanslick calls Geist in his special sense, and we're not wallowing in it, but we're not wallowing, we're following. I mean that's the Hanslick thing. Music is something you follow, and you follow its structures, and that's the complexity of Bach can be like a complexity of a dome in a mosque, where you've got this complex structure and you're seeing how all these patterns fit together. And so you can, as I was saying in the architecture talk, then okay, and maybe I didn't say that in that piece, once that's in place, once you've got the musical beauty in place, then it can play its role. Then you can affix meanings to it. Then one can be a national anthem or have some religious function or blah, blah, blah. But only once the musical beauty is in place, which is something abstract, not denying that you can then humanize it, and then it can have these meanings in a sense. Then you can use it as a code, but only because it's something else first. So maybe I don't know if I'd have to look at that sentence again. But there's what music does essentially, if we want to talk in that way. It does in a way which is pretty abstract, and then any other role it has, it can only have because it does that more pure thing.
Free musical beauty must come before the dependent musical beauty.
Stimmt, genau.
But I'm going to take. Do you want to say something about that?
No.
I'm going to take the reference to mathematics and be a little naughty.
Okay.
Because
yes.
It reminds me of your debate with John Barker.
No, I'm in trouble.
What you just said, is there something inconsistent there with what you defended against John Barker about mathematical beauty, or?
Well, he wrote a very good critique of me. I don't know if you remember, but I remember at the time I went.
Almost.
I mean, I was on the back foot, because this is the context of this is the question of the kinds of things that can have beauty, and I was being restrictive about that and claiming that in order to be a sort of candidate for beauty, you have to have a kind of sensuous nature of some kind. So there's something in music that we listen to, and there are tones, but there are also sounds. And in the visual arts, you've got design, but you've also got colours and shapes, and then you've got design. Something Kant talks about as qualities of design are what we're responding to, not the pure colours. So the context of that is then I wanted to say where there's no sensuous nature at all, then beauty has no place. So, for example, with conceptual art and with mathematics, I wanted to say that if they're purely to be conceived but not perceived, then it's doing something else, and it may be great what it's doing and good in its own way, but it's not a matter of beauty. And so mathematics, conceptual art it's an art in a broad sense, but it's doing something very different from the art of the beauty that you find in a lot of other visual arts. So I wanted to step, and I tried to argue against a sort of abstract beauty, basically against Plato, and who was corrupted by the goddess Diotima, to believe that there's a kind of lower beauty of sights and sounds in the Republic and in the Symposium, but then there's some kind of higher beauty that attaches to abstract objects like mathematical objects, and of course above all the forms themselves. So the ultimate beautiful thing is the beautiful, whereas this is obviously in Plato's studies immensely controversial, this idea of self-predication, but I wanted to say that actually that's a too radical extension of a normal notion of beauty, which depends on something perceivable at root. So you're right to pressure there in a way, because we follow the music. So if you think about Hanslick's view, and when we're talking about Hanslick, can I recommend to everyone that chapter 4 and 5, which is the first part that was written of the book, and so you have the relations between tones. You've got a threefold structure. You've got the musical beauty, which is held up or dependent on relations between tones, but they also have to have a material substrate, which is sound. So you've got a distinction of sound and tone, which Scruton also makes and doesn't in his book, and doesn't cite Hanslick, which is a crime. He should have done it, because it's straight out, it's textbook Hanslick. So that there has to be something sensuous to be perceived. There has to be the perceivable material substrate, both in the visual arts and in the case of beauty, but the appreciation, tones are not, were there no sounds, there would be no tones. So there has to be sound for there to be the musically beautiful. Our attention when we're attending to music, and it's all about attention, that's the crucial thing in Hanslick. It's this, which is something he gets from Brentano, who he gets from Herbart, ultimately the idea of intentionality, which is very fundamental for Hanslick's way of thinking about things. What are you attending to? The way beauty arises from structures of tones. And of course you're aware of the material substrate, but that's not what you're... so you need your body. It's a bit like a Cartesian picture in a way. You need your body to be doing the perceiving, but no body, no perception. Descartes going to agree with that. But then the mind, the intellectual aspect of the mind, is attending to the tones supported by the material substrate and the way the tones generate musical beauty. That's what you're following and attending to. So in that sense, it's abstract, but in other ways, and then there are these relations between the tones that looks kind of mathematical, and that there's a bunch of relations between items. Some people see mathematics in terms of items with structural relations between them, but all that is supported by something we perceive, and that's unlike mathematics.
I don't resist. This is a quote. We've talked about it, but I don't resist mentioning it here. Perhaps the worst music I've heard is that of the Canadian pop rock singer Bryan Adams.
Yes.
What is interesting is that one would not want to say that his music is ugly in the sense of being jarring and unpleasantly discordant. Instead, it is all too sickly smooth and bland, rather like very sweet, artificial tasting, fizzy drinks.
Yes.
I love the metaphor. Perhaps there is even something superficially agreeable about it, of the kind that might generate the catchy addictiveness of tunes that get stuck in one's head against his will. However, Bryan Adams clearly intends his music to have aesthetic value, which is part of what is so cringe-making about it. And I always thought, ever since I read this, that this is your least formalist statement in the whole book.
Cringe-making, yeah.
Because this cringe-making, this is aesthetic judgment. And somehow the fact that he clearly intends his music to have aesthetic value is part of it.
Yes.
So,
well, I mean, someone, I won't say who it was, but there's a textbook on aesthetics, and they say this is quite a good philosopher, but there's a textbook, and they get a bit on aesthetic theories of art, and they say, well, the trouble with aesthetic theories of art is there would be no bad art. It's quite a well-known philosopher of music who actually wrote that, and I complained to him. I said, look, in a second edition, please tweak that. It's ridiculous. Christy Maguire's extremely good on this in his book.
Art and Art Attempts.
Yeah. So, you know, things can go wrong, but there's I suppose I was wanting to say, in as far as it's aspiring to be music, and it is. I mean, something, this is just an old point about functions that Ruth Millikan emphasizes, that something can have a function even though they don't discharge it. So Bryan Adams, you know, some music like that has been created with a certain intent to create certain kinds of musical value in virtue of certain tones artistically combined, in Hanslick's terms, but it doesn't. So, you know, they've attempted to do something like if I attempted to, you know, I could attempt to build something that fell down. So I suppose in that case, what is the idea of being cringe-making about it? They've you know, there's an aspiration to make something. I mean, in a sense, he has successfully achieved a certain aesthetic effect, right? So you can't deny for music that you dislike in that way. It's not that they've failed to achieve these mid-level aesthetic notions. So this is something we haven't talked about. Back to Sibley, there's the evaluative aesthetic notions, beauty and the like, and then there's these mid-level descriptions, which I might use, sickly sweet, I might use, but then there is certainly an effect that musician has brought off, an aesthetic effect they've successfully brought off, but then the question is, what kind of value does that realize? And I suppose that there was a gap between the aspiration and the fulfillment. I don't know if that's speaks to the cringe, but I was trying that at least ways of explaining what looks like a kind of failure in a sense. But obviously lots of people like that kind of stuff. And then the question would be, what kind of critique is it? What kind of discussion are you going to have when you meet people who like that kind of stuff rather than the kind of more intense music that I tend to prefer? And it might be quite interesting, I think, to see how the conversation developed. And this is when you get to some really difficult points in aesthetics, which I think only really Scruton has a go at recently, but maybe some of the Continentals do in their own way. That when so with someone who's really into Bryan Adams, for example, suppose we get into debate and discussion. The debate is unlikely to remain focused just on music. It's going to be, there are going to be broader values at stake. And that is significant. And that, if you wanted to put pressure on me, I reckon that's a good place. So you sort of found a good place. It's the kind of thing that the sentimentalists would do well at, because for them there's no radical separation between our aesthetic and moral sensibilities. So, yeah, there's a question about how that discussion would go, and I accept that I might have to struggle a bit to retain my purity, have to retain my purity as that discussion went along. I agree with that. I'm sort of accepting there's a problem there.
Okay, another question I don't resist asking. In your discussion of the role of metaphor in the description of music, you say, at some point you say something that's really provocative to Wittgensteinians.
I love to be provocative to Wittgensteinians. They have got it coming.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this particular bit I'm thinking about is, there is no such thing as a private language argument.
Oh yes.
In Wittgenstein.
Well, yeah. When I wrote that, I'd read an awful lot of Wittgenstein, and I was convinced, especially that the investigations, it wasn't clearly there. Man möchte sagen. The whole private language argument is prefaced by this word, one wants to say. One wants to say. I mean, that's not an assertion. He's not saying this is true. He says there's some inclination to say. And at other points in the investigation, he says there's an inclination to say this thing, but yet it's wrong. There's another point in the investigation, he says exactly that. So why in 258, the whole private language argument hinges on this sentence which has that in front of it. So I think there's a sort of close reading that Wittgensteinians almost never do of the text. But I was in touch with David Stern, who's a proper scholar, unlike most Wittgensteinians who are pretty lazy at reading Wittgenstein, I think. They sort of read what they want to read. In the Philosophical Occasions book, there's a couple of what were unpublished lectures on sense data, and at the moment those particular texts, there's lectures on privacy and on sense data there's a couple of where that's the only things I've found so far which look like he might be committed to denying the possibility and actuality of private languages. So since I wrote that, I've seen these other two texts, but I still think the investigations, there's not clearly one there. But the trouble is, I was talking to Hanoch Ben-Yami about this the other day. The investigations, he's trouble with St. Ludwig is this Karl Kraus in the background, this kind of Austrian theorist of writing who's got a certain insistence on integrity and style, and he's very stylistically committed, and style is incredibly important to him. Style is the man, and that sort of integrity in writing and in presenting his what he says is very important. So he's not primarily concerned with communication, funnily enough, but in some of especially the stuff in English, it's where there's a lecture which is actually written for a public audience, and it's much easier to follow his train of argument and how he's actually reasoning about these things. And so some of those texts need a lot more reading. So at the moment I'm a bit agnostic about it. I'm not sure. I might want to backtrack on that claim. Certainly what most Wittgensteinians say about Wittgenstein is just incredible to me. You can read the text, which is just plainly saying, he says, like, the essential thing about private sensations is blah, blah, blah. That's in the investigations. And they'll say, oh, here he's denying the existence of privacy, of private sensation. You think, no, actually the text says the opposite of that. But it's like, I suppose, it's like a sort of people are just projecting onto it what they want to read, and usually it's some kind of, Oxford mid-century, conceptual analysis philosophy that gets projected onto the text. It's a bit random. There are people writing on Wittgenstein, but they tend not to be Wittgensteinians. But there is the text deserves more in-depth, sort of nitty-bitty, picky scholarship than it's received. It tends to be very impressionistic, But basically, any book on Wittgenstein, if you open it and it begins with the idea, it begins with a sentence like, "You've got to understand that Wittgenstein is aiming to dethrone the whole of philosophy and show how it's all nonsense," and then let's see what he says about particular movements, particular passages, and that sort of global way. That Wittgensteinian approach to Wittgenstein is just hopeless and a waste of time, and is makes people feel good when they read it, but he becomes so much less interesting because he becomes a negative philosopher, and very little of Wittgenstein has that kind of negativity. Look, suppose you're a great philosopher. You're a great philosopher. What are you going to spend your whole time doing? Showing how, how
this is such a waste of time.
The rest of philosophy is not worthwhile. Is that really, a great enterprise? No, he has lots of positive things. He makes many positive claims. That Colin McGinn book, I think, is quite good, from 1984. He says, look, here are the negative claims, here's the positive claims. And he makes lots of positive claims. And the idea that he's a negative philosopher, I think, is disastrous.
Okay, moving to another point. Another quotation from the book. If you do not like smoked salmon, you are not lacking in judgment in the way that you are if you do not appreciate the beauty of the Alhambra. So, okay, what if I say that I prepare gin with Schweppes instead of fever tree tonic and what you
Angostura bitters?
Yeah. Am I lacking in judgment if I say that?
Yeah. As Hume points out, there are some points where there's kind of there are variations, with Ovid and Tacitus, and the younger man and the older man, and Angostura bitters really falls into that. Some people just don't like Angostura bitters, and I rather like just a little. You can overdo it. It's like soy sauce. You don't want too much on your sushi. You've got to have the right amount, otherwise it's not icky. That's a Japanese aesthetic concept, icky, which is quite hard to grasp. But the idea is, I'm just vindicating, it's just going along with Kant there, that there's a difference between pleasures of aesthetic taste and pleasures in culinary matters, which they can be important in their own way, and they even have, Scruton's also good on this, they even have their own sort of quasi-objectivity in their expression. One of his examples I remember is lamb tastes better with garlic. Say, well, it does, but Kant will see this as having something like a general but not a universal claim, if I remember my third critique right, in section 6-7, I think it is. So that you wouldn't find it in the syntax, but you're supposed to find it in the semantics of claims about taste. There's a kind of claim to correctness we make in one area, but not the other. And Kant theorizes that in a way where they have a different claim, because one in Kant, well, I'm sure you know, its claim is as an appeal to those who share our rational faculties. The other, you cannot make a claim to those who don't share your sensory faculties, so people who taste things in a very different way. It's not unlike Hanslick's distinction between the sort of the material mode and the tones. But I'm persuaded by Alex Wilfing from Vienna that it would be a mistake to see a direct influence of Kant on Hanslick. There could be, it was a common distinction. There are enough other differences between Kant and Hanslick anyway, and there's all sorts of other intellectual sources for those kind of distinctions. So, I mean, I've had kickback on that, and a lot of people want to say, well, there is a kind of similarity. There isn't the kind of dissimilarity in the kind of correctness claimed. But but I tend to hold that, which means that it's a kind of discrimination against the lower senses of taste and smell. However much we relish them and enjoy food and drink, it doesn't engage Geist in Hanslick's sense, our intellectual selves in the same way. So I'd want to insist on that distinction, kind of unfashionable now, where everyone's into kind of multi-sensuous and all the senses are flowing together, and in architecture we have to lick buildings and taste them and whatever. I think there's something in that kind of hierarchy, and in the kind of, I suppose it goes back to this earlier question about possibly this connection with mathematics. There's a kind of abstraction we can attain in our visual and oral perceptual experiences, which is it's an abstraction sort of from the matter. It's difficult to defend that because it turns out that you don't want colour to be irrelevant in painting. It was for people like, for some of the early British formalists, where you have Fry and Bell, you have a sort of sculptural representation of this sculptural mass, and the question is, you can actually decolour a Cézanne by squinting at it, and then the question is what's lost. And of course you've got the sort of the joy of the French countryside and the lovely summer, and that all goes. You've got something, the question is, it is a shame to lose that. So maybe you've got a bit of work to do to explain, the formalist has work to do, both in the visual arts and in music, to explain why colour matters and combinations of colours. You see, that's maybe the way back, there. And similarly, of course, timbre matters. The tone quality of an instrument, of course, matters. And the specific, but but then I suppose maybe Hanslick can come back, or a visual formalist could come back and say, look, hang on, no, I didn't say all the colours are irrelevant, because you've still got the relations between the colours. There's still a sort of formal connection between those colour elements. If it's a pure, you see, Kant in the Third Critique, a pure enjoyment of the colour yellow, you can do that. So suppose I just I stare at a yellow wall, and it's just, I suppose, there's special blues, people make paintings of special blues. How is that engaging our aesthetic faculties, or the pure, there are some sounds which are, unpleasant or pleasant. Of course, that's, I was going to say part of music, but I shouldn't say that. I was going to say that's part of music. It's sort of course, it's part of what a composer works with, but its music is a whole lot more than those qualities of sound which are pleasant and unpleasant in their own way. So maybe the thing to say is, our pleasures in, this is a kind of musicological thing to say, there's a variety of things that we're enjoying, or can be enjoying in different cases of different kinds of music, but suppose you've got a beautiful soprano, soprano with, it's callous or something, you've just got a wonderful tone, and you're enjoying other things, that can be, you can be having many kinds of pleasure at one time. And if Taruskin's right about Bach, it's the sort of opposite case of Callas, because it's better if it sounds rather bad. And for Taruskin claims that Bach is trying to actually not quite break the instrument, but composing things where the instrument's not going to work and it's going to make a horrible noise. And that's supposed to be what he's aiming at, as a kind of ugliness, he claims. But then the thought is that contrary to Taruskin, I would say that the pleasure in the way that all fits together, those kind of ugly tones can fit together to make beautiful music of a kind of intensity. So, yeah, I'm struggling. What I'm doing is I'm struggling, I think, not too unsuccessfully, to engage with the sort of the material of visual art, the colours, which are obviously important, and the timbre and the sounds, which is obviously important, in a way which doesn't subtract the basic formalist insights. Put it in Kant's terms, if you like, there's pleasure in beauty. He didn't put it quite like that, but there's pleasure in beauty, and then there's pleasure in the agreeable. And there could be where you've got an absolutely wonderful singer, a Callas or someone, you can enjoy the tone, an agreeable tone, an agreeable sound, I should say. Agreeable sound, at the same time as appreciating the musical beauty, and you could do both at the same time. But in the Bach case, according to Taruskin, there's the disagreeable sound, but you can also fit that together with the musical beauty, musically beautiful, with a hyphen.
Would you describe Kant as a formalist? Because I'm thinking of Noel Carroll and all those.
No, I wouldn't. It's commonly done. I basically no. And I sort of get depressed when I see him described yet again as an aesthetic formalist. Dependent beauty's right there.
Okay.
And he thinks, dependent beauty thinks, I think poetry, is it the case of poetry? It can even have a greater value. I mean, if a formalist is someone who says there's only formal aesthetic, there's only formal beauty, then Kant's not a formalist, because there's dependent beauty. So he does, so it's very common to hear people say that. But
I think this particular point you agree with Carroll and Young that Kant is not a formalist.
Do they say that? Okay, then I
do.
You read more than me then,
So okay, we should conclude this talk on music with actual music. And I've never seen you play the piano in your house, but I have seen you play the accordion. And yesterday, harmonica.
Yes.
Not classical music.
Well, I'm a tango fan, so I shouldn't really confess this because it might seem inconsistent with my slightly hardline puritanical views. And tango is often seen as very emotional music.
Guilty pleasure.
So it may be a guilty pleasure, perhaps. Very much like tango, I dance it as well, but obviously since COVID it's been a disaster for all that. I first discovered tango from a philosopher of science colleague when I was doing my doctorate, who I met a lot later, who then became a psychologist. It's David Agnardo, who's a bass player, who used to play bass with Van Morrison and other people. He left philosophy and then became a musician and then came back to psychology. And he introduced me to Piazzolla, and then I found Gardel in America and discovered more about tango. Piazzolla's interesting because he gets classified as jazz, classical music, and as folk. You could find him if you try to find where he is in a music shop. He's multi-classifiable. And then I started doing some dancing, and then they play music there, and I discovered people like Pugliese. Pugliese is wonderful. He's the kind of Beethoven of tango. He's sort of, there's this intense beat, and of course it's wonderful the way they've got the bandoneon and they break it on their legs like this. I had a bandoneon and I sold it because I failed to play it. And then there's Diaz, who plays the harmonica, and I'm nothing like his. But anyway, let me play some. Anyway, so that might all be a refutation of everything I believe about music, but then consistency.
Anslic's deleted ending.
Perhaps, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's an inconsistency there. But certainly, I mean, Pugliese is something which is unlike Piazzolla. Piazzolla is sort of intellectual in a way, and you shouldn't really dance to it. You can dance to Piazzolla, and people do. It's a bit affected, I think, whereas Pugliese is for dancing in a way. I mean, some music is for dancing, and it's not pure music in that sense. I mean, although, you know, in Bach you have these dance themes, I've never said that music should be pure, that there shouldn't be this impure music. I wrote a whole paper saying that Hanslick believes in impure music as well. So in the case of tango, a lot of tango makes sense. People danced to it, and it was for dancing in a way. Pugliese, Piazzolla takes it and makes something an art, a purely cerebral art form. You can sit and listen to it, and it's a different kind of thing in a way. And just as Bach contains dance themes within his music, it doesn't mean, and that's sort of part of it, and he's drawing on that tradition. Piazzolla's drawing on the tradition where you make something for dancing, but it's to some extent though with Pugliese you get it more when you dance to it, and you get rumph, rumph, and that's like wow. Which sometimes that's not a matter of purely intellectual contemplation. So, but I don't think there's a fundamental inconsistency because it's an impure art form. It has its formal side, and this is also, it has other functions as well as that, which it achieves only because it has certain formal values. So the formal is still, so I'm not a sort of absolutist formalist, but there's a priority to the formal values, explanatory and priority to the formal values, without which it wouldn't have the other ones. So I'm defensive here, so trying to defend my love of tango in spite of my academic views. So.
Thank you so much.
You should shake hands.
High five.
That's it.